Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everybody, to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos. And hey, I hope all of you had a nice holiday season so far with your family, maybe being off work a little bit. Last week we had a Christmas football story, and since it's still football season, today we're going to have a New Year's Day, more or less, a New Year's Day football story. So let's go back to college football in the 1980s when I was really becoming a huge sports fan, and specifically to bowl season. Because for any Gen X football fan, New Year's Day or thereabouts, let's just say any time between, say, Christmas Day and New Year's Day, that used to be all about college football and the bowl games. And the best bowl games were played on New Year's Day, the big ones. Hopefully the ones that decided national championships. And for the one we're talking about today in 1987, this was only the sixth time in the bowl system era that number one met number two, the ranked number one team versus the ranked number two team, for a national title game that would be decided actually on the field. And I'm talking about January 2nd, 1987, Tempe, Arizona, the Fiesta Bowl. 73,000 people in the stands, and what was at stake? A national championship and a showdown of two completely opposite teams. I'm talking about the 1987 Fiesta Bowl with the Penn State Nittany Lions and the Miami Hurricanes. On one sideline, you had the undefeated, high-flying, swagger-soaked Miami Hurricanes, who arrived in Tempe, and if you can believe this today, me saying it, I remember seeing it on the news that night, but Miami, the Hurricanes, they got off of their jet in Arizona wearing camouflaged military fatigues. That's right. They got off the plane in fatigues, talking trash to every camera within reach. And this was a cast on the Hurricanes roster of a lot of future NFL picks, a lot of future first-round NFL picks, Pro Bowlers, future legends all the way around. A lot of future NFL players were going to be on the field for this game, but most of them were from the very talented Miami Hurricanes roster. And then, on the other sideline, you had what was really as boring gets in so many ways, especially for the young fans, right? The quiet, blue-collar Nittany Lions of Penn State. They were built on discipline, fundamentals, defensive execution, straight out of, a coaching clinic, basically. No flash whatsoever, no bravado whatsoever, no bulletin board material whatsoever, just Penn State in those plain uniforms, just football. So this was the ultimate clash. Of style versus substance, speed versus discipline, flash versus the fundamentals, and swagger versus silence. And all you need to know about that is to know the coaches, of course, who were Jimmy Johnson for the Miami Hurricanes and Joe Paterno for the Penn State Nittany Lions. And yes, I sat there and watched that game. I was caught up in the hype. I was in high school. And I was caught up in this as much as any other sports fan was. And what unfolded for that game over those four quarters, it gave us a really dramatic and one of the more, from what I can remember, one of the more talked about national championship games that college football had seen in a while. So grab your seat and let's talk a little bit about how boring old plain Jane Penn State took down the talented and seemingly unbeatable Miami Hurricanes in the story of the 1987 Fiesta Bowl. So to appreciate this, you kind of have to put yourself back in those times and think about the situation around you. and why this still matters. So let's step back into the landscape in the mid-'80s, and let's start with Miami. Jimmy Johnson was the head coach of the Miami Hurricanes. Remember, they had won a national championship under Howard Schnellenberger earlier in the decade, but then he left for was it USFL? Can't remember. I think so. He left, and Jimmy Johnson took over. So 86 was his third regular season. And in 86, remember, this gets confusing. Let's talk about the dates quickly. We're talking about the regular season of 1986. And then when the calendar turns into 1987, you still had bowl games on January 1st and January 2nd. This was January 2nd, 1987. So the 86 regular season saw the Miami Hurricanes go 11-0, their first undefeated season. And from 83 onward, when Jimmy took over the Hurricanes, they weren't just good. And we've talked about them before. They were really redefining what college football looked like and sounded like. They were fast. They brought swagger, attitude. All of that was wrapped into this defense they had that hit hard. They hit anything moving. And then an offense full of track meet type speed, world-class speed, and your prototypical quarterback who ran the whole show was Vinny Testaverde. And that season, in 1986 regular season, he won the Heisman Trophy. And they gave him every other trophy that you could give a college offensive player that year. And he was the quarterback of what was considered one of the most talented teams ever assembled at that time. The defensive speed was off the charts, and Testaverde was a sure thing hit, everyone thought, in the NFL. And so if you add in the swagger that they brought, if you can't talk about Miami Hurricanes without talking about their swagger. And so you either find that refreshing or you find that infuriating. Okay, that's just the way it is. But on their side, they were 11-0, and they were ranked number 1 in the nation, which they should have been, going into this Fiesta Bowl. On the other side, you had Penn State, Joe Paterno's quiet empire, their quiet little dynasty. Well, they were so methodical and disciplined, and they just lined up and played football. Not a whole lot of trash talking, not a whole lot of chest thumping. They were just a team all about preparation and being there for the moment. They entered the game also 11-0, but they were ranked number 2 behind the Hurricanes. And let's be honest, and I can remember this clearly from just talking to, high school buddies and family and whatnot, nobody thought Penn State could hang with Miami that year. Nobody. I wish I had looked up the odds. I don't know what they were, but there's no way Penn State was favored. The press didn't believe in the Nittany Lions, and the Vegas odds makers, even though I don't know the specifics, they certainly had them as underdogs. And the broadcast team from NBC, they talked about it like the Nittany Lions were huge underdogs. And Miami thought Penn State was underdogs as well, which is also important, right? There's that fine line between confidence and overconfidence. And really, it wasn't just about football that week. If you're listening to this and you're my age, it wasn't. It wasn't just about football. It was about a culture clash, okay? And I can remember so well seeing Miami get off that plane and those camouflage fatigues, and they were talking a lot of noise about going to war, which is not a good analogy anymore. That's very dated. You don't put sports in the same terminology as something that costs people their lives. It's not so PC to do that. But back then, people did it. And they show up in their camo and they talk about going to war. And they roasted Penn State at every opportunity when the cameras were and the recorders were on. They were brash, loud, charismatic, unfiltered, whatever you want to call them. And, of course, that's what Jimmy Johnson wanted. Jimmy Johnson believed in psychology. He majored in psychology, industrial psychology, in college. He believed in the power of psyching out your opponents, so that's why he let them be that way. Okay, he said that on the record 100 times. Penn State, They showed up in their suits like all other teams did back then. Per usual, they answered their questions when given. Very polite. They watched Miami from a distance doing all the swagger stuff, and they didn't say much. And probably on strict orders from Paterno, they did not engage whatsoever and give Miami any bulletin board material. Now, I don't remember this at the time, but the Fiesta Bowl officials took advantage of all this hype. So NBC and the Fiesta Bowl officials agreed to move the game to prime time, which was a major risk back then, and it paid off. This became the most watched college football game ever at that point. And you have to stress that because, there's more TVs and more houses now and so forth, and things are just completely out of whack. But at the time, this was the early days still in a lot of the country for cable. And so this was largely held during the 3-channel days. And so to be the most watched game ever at that point was a pretty big deal. The Hurricanes, full of confidence, and Penn State, full of calm. That's all you can say. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. So this was a story tailor-made for television, and that's what NBC and the Fiesta Bowl wanted to take advantage of by moving this to primetime. So let's remind ourselves of some of the players involved. Miami, the blueprint for really what the NFL turned into, really. Heisman quarterback was Vinny Testaverde, plus Offensive Player of the Year and all kinds of things. They had the elite wide receivers in Michael Irvin, Brian Blades, Brett Perriman. They had a roster on defense absolutely just stacked. Jerome Brown, the defensive tackle, Benny Blades, the safety, both NFLers. Alonzo Highsmith was a running back, fullback type NFL player. Russell Maryland, defensive tackle. Back then they called him the nose guard type guy, NFL player. Melvin Bratton, another running back, NFL player. I mean, on and on and on with Miami's roster. Explosive, fast, violent. They averaged 35 points per game that season. And, I've said on here before, I think, that 28 points used to be a lot to score in a football game. And when I say that, I'm talking about that era. And so 35 was scoring a lot of points back in the day. And they had already beaten Oklahoma and Florida State that year, two obviously blue blood type franchises or colleges. And they were the national villains, basically, or the darlings, depending on your point of view, right? And so they weren't just beating teams that year. They were really humiliating them. And this was the peak, or maybe the beginning of the peak, Miami Hurricane, the U culture, loud, fun, unapologetic, but backed it up most of the time because they were really, really good. And like I've said, all of this encouraged by Jimmy Johnson. And for Penn State, not a lot of names to talk about necessarily, and I think that's the way they wanted it. They were the counterpoint to all of the other Miami hype. John Schaefer was their quarterback. Solid, steady, nothing spectacular. I don't remember him having an NFL career. Maybe he was a backup. You probably do remember a guy named DJ Dozier or Dozier. I don't know how he pronounced it. I can't remember. But he was powerful as a running back, really good. Blair Thomas, another name you'll remember, was a running back on that roster. Their defense was very fundamentally sound, and they were very, very well coached. Their offense, pretty conservative, I don't know if Paterno believed in the notion that if you throw the ball, 3 things can happen and 2 of them are bad, but it kind of seems like it. The defense, very disciplined, very much the film study type of guys. And, attitude-wise, just really wasn't there, just quiet confidence. There wasn't a whole lot of braggadocious things about them. So nobody thought Penn State could win a high-scoring game with the Hurricanes. And honestly, I don't think to this day Penn State ever thought it was going to come to that anyway. I think their goal was to just outlast Miami and keep the score as absolutely low as possible, because surely they didn't believe they could win a shootout. According to research, Penn State's game plan was pretty simple. Make Miami drive the length of the field as often as possible. Don't give up any big plays. Keep everything in front of the secondary. Keep the ball in front of you, meaning what I just said. Keep the secondary behind all the receivers. Force Testaverde into making decisions and making mistakes, and make Miami earn every yard they got. And so, if, in other words, they're going to have to be really patient on offense, is what Penn State's game plan was. And you hear about this a lot, and it sounds like a good idea. It just doesn't always work that way for the defense. But knowing the opponents now, when I researched this and got to reading some of these quotes and things, knowing the matchup, it makes total sense. One word you will never hear described about Miami to describe Miami that year was patient. And that's what Penn State was gambling on them being able to do. Be patient and drive the ball down the field in small chunks. But Miami didn't want to do that. And so this was strength against strength, meaning Penn State's defense really against Miami's offense. And so, so let's talk about how that matchup happened. So to start the game, the one term I hate to use in football, man, I hate to use this, and I guess that's what I just described, but Penn State's defense was definitely playing bend but don't break, and I so hate that term. I so hate that style, but from the opening kickoff, it was pretty obvious that the Hurricanes were a little bit out of sync. Penn State definitely played back and played bend but don't break. And it kind of worked to perfection for them. Testaverde was moving the ball, but every time he got up near the red zone, Penn State tightened up and made a play when they had to. Miami, they had a lot of drop passes. They made some mental mistakes, the kind that killed drives. The holding penalty after a big passing play, those kinds of things. And then Testaverde, even in the first quarter, you could tell Testaverde was forcing some things. And Penn State's linebackers were actually playing this huge mental game with him. And after the first quarter, when it ended scoreless, it kind of looked like Miami's offense was getting a little bit frustrated. And maybe Penn State's plan was actually working. So in the second quarter, they finally got moving, Miami. And Melvin Bratton scored a 1-yard plunge with 6:38 left in the half to go up 7-0 for Miami. But Penn State, with their slow, kind of methodical offense, they answered with a 4-yard TD from quarterback John Schaefer with 1:14 left in the second quarter and in the half. And so they went into halftime tied 7-7. And I think America and the announcers and everybody else had one thing on their mind, which is, wait, is this actually happening? Is this, as they jog off the field to go get their Gatorade and their pep talks, is this really 7-7? And I think a lot of people, including Miami and their coach and their players and their fans, probably thought, okay, we had a bad half, and we'll get in there during the halftime break, and we'll talk things out, and we'll come back out focused, and we'll come back out knowing our game plan is going to work, and we'll get down to business. So how exactly did the second half unfold? Well, it certainly started out a lot better for Miami. It looked like in the second half that they might actually finally take control of the game. They were moving the ball really well between the 20s, big plays, chunk yardage. Classic sort of Miami, taking advantage of their speed and getting into a little bit of a rhythm. But keep in mind, Penn State was playing not to break. And so every time Miami got closer and closer, Penn State would force a turnover or hold them to a field goal attempt. And then the game kind of took on its identity. The theme finally emerged in the third quarter. And that's because Miami, meaning Vinny Testaverde, started throwing interceptions. And he just kept throwing interception, one right after the other. He threw against a zone defense in which Penn State used 5 linebackers to help disguise their coverages. Now, I don't remember that at the time being the strategy. I'm, reading about it now. It sounds really interesting that they put that many linebackers out there, and I guess that, confused Testaverde on who was blitzing, who was covering the back, who was covering the tight end, and so forth. And so whatever that alignment was with 5 linebackers, and I'm assuming they put their 5 best coverage linebackers out there, it really confused Testaverde, is what history says. And Penn State defenders, the linebackers especially, they were playing off and they were reading Testaverde's eyes. They weren't blitzing a whole lot. They weren't gambling on anything. They were simply sitting there in coverage and letting Testaverde scan the field and try to force plays into windows that they hoped to close and make them smaller than normal. And it did eventually frustrate Testaverde and therefore Miami as the second half wore on. It looked like they might have even panicked a few times. They completely abandoned the run and leaned entirely on Testaverde's arm. And then Penn State for sure tightened the noose. However, even though that was true and Miami's offense was struggling, their defense did not let them down, okay? The defense kept them in the game. Jerome Brown and the rest of that front seven, they played hard. And they were playing some smash-mouth football against Penn State's offense. And they were giving the ball back to their Testaverde-led offense over and over and over. And finally, Miami kicked a field goal and made it 10-7 in the second half. It seems like order had been restored in the universe with Miami getting ahead. But Penn State, they were not done. They responded with a drive that could only be described as classic Paterno. The short power runs, misdirection, patience, all that kind of things. And even though Miami's defense was really, really good and really, really physical. So let's break down how exactly Penn State ended up with the 14-10 lead over Miami. So Penn State scored in the second half on a 6-yard touchdown by DJ Dozier with 8:13 left in the game. Miami moved the ball, but they fumbled it back to Penn State, and Penn State stalled themselves, setting the stage for a final Miami drive with 3 minutes and 7 seconds left in the game. Keep in mind, Penn State is leading 14-10. After a punt, Miami is taking over on their own 23-yard line with 3 minutes and 7 seconds left in the game, trailing by 4. So let's talk about that final game-defining drive. We say it all the time, right? Just drive the field and score. No biggie, right? Field goal does you no good if you're Miami. You take over on your own 23-yard line, 3 minutes, 7 seconds on the clock. On first down, I went back and rewatched this so I could tell you play-by-play what happened. On first down, Testaverde scrambled for 4 yards up to the 27-yard line. On second down, with 2 minutes and 38 seconds left in the game, he almost threw an interception. Penn State almost picked him off. So very little clock run. With 2 minutes and 31 seconds, that left third down and 6 from the 27-yard line, and he threw another incomplete pass. The game is completely on the line on fourth down and 6 from the 27-yard line. 2 minutes, 24 seconds left, and Vinny Testaverde completes a 32-yard pass to Brian Blades. So now has a first down on the 43-yard line on Penn State's side of the field with 2 minutes and 16 seconds left. He completes another pass to Benny Blades down to the 35-yard line. Now, with 1 minute and 51 seconds left in the game, he has second down on the 35 and 3 to go. He completes a pass to Perryman to the 26. So now we're at first and 10, a minute 34 left in the game, and he completes one to Michael Irvin down to the 22-yard line. Now we're at a minute and 9 left in the game, second and 6 from the 22, and he completes another one to Irvin down to the 10-yard line, a gain of 12. Now the clock is stopped for first down and an injury by Penn State, okay? So, you know, who knows if that was a legit injury, but they granted the timeout for injury with a minute and 1 second left in the game. The clock was stopped on first down. On 1st and goal from the 10-yard line, they completed a pass. Testaverde completed to Urban down to the 5-yard line. On 2nd and goal with 30 seconds left on the clock, Testaverde was sacked and Miami called timeout. With 25 seconds left in the game, on 3rd and goal from the 13, Testaverde threw an incomplete pass. Now we're down to 18 seconds left. It's 4th and goal from the 13-yard line, and Testaverde was intercepted by linebacker Pete Gistopoulos, and that was it. Game over. And I remember that guy stepping in front of that pass like it was yesterday. So everything the media had predicted and everything Miami had promised came down to that final snap. What did I say it was? 18 seconds left, 4th and goal from the 13, and Miami had to pass. And, yeah, Pete Giftopoulos, I believe he had 2 interceptions in the game, and I believe Shane Conlon had 2 interceptions as well, if I'm not mistaken. So Testaverde threw 5 total interceptions, and Miami had 7 total turnovers, if you can believe that. Can you believe in that game the favored team had 7 turnovers? Here's what's crazy. So the final score was Penn State, of course, 14, Miami 10. Miami outgained Penn State 445 yards to 162 total yards for Penn State. And Miami also had 22 first downs. Now, if you bend but don't break, and that's your philosophy, like I said, it usually sounds good, but for them to do that and keep the score down as low as they did, it's just it's unbelievable that they gave up only 10 points. Bill Parcells had a saying that for every 100 yards you gain in offense, you should have 7 points. And so they should have scored about 31 points. But no, I said Penn State, Miami. Miami should have had 31-ish or so points according to the Parcells formula. They were held to 10. And, Penn State, what a job by Miami's defense to hold Penn State to 14 points when they were known for their punishing, clock-killing offense. And so it was just such a clash of 2 different types of teams, just unbelievable that after all of that, it was so low scoring and came down to a 4th and goal play, to end the game like that. I knew I blew right through the whole thing about the final drive, and it's hard to describe that, so I apologize. But I will put a link on here to the game, and you can go watch it for yourself, fast forward to the end, whatever you want to do. But basically, with a minute left in the game, give or take, you had 3 plays in a row run all the way down to the 18-second mark. So 1st down, 1st and goal, they had a completion to Urban down to the 5, and then a sack, and then an incomplete pass, and then with 18 seconds left on 4th and goal from the 13, Testaverde was intercepted. So that kind of sums up how that last drive happened. Of course, Miami took the loss hard. Many of those people still their players still talk about it today. And let's put some history around this. To Miami's credit, they responded by starting one of the greatest runs in college football history after that night. I mean, the next 3 years, I guess, they were nearly unstoppable. But it's like this for any sports event. On any given night, any given team can beat another one, theoretically. And so for that night, January 2nd, 1987, Penn State turned the sports world kind of on its ear, right? Nobody, and I mean nobody, believed Penn State could win that game except probably them and their fans. And so they believed it, though, and that's what mattered. And that's why really the 1987 Fiesta Bowl is one of the greatest and most unforgettable bowl games in history, because it was even though it was the number 1 team versus the number 2 team in the country, in so many people's minds, it was such a mismatch. And yet, Yet Penn State proved that you can beat anybody on any given night. So that's what's fun about this particular story. That's what's fun about college football, and that's what's fun about sports in general. So I hope you enjoyed going back to January 2nd, 1987 with me. Make sure you follow GenX Classic Sports and on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Follow us on all of them. That'd be fine too. And we'll get to more great bowl games, teams, players, moments from the 70s and 80s and 90s. We're winding down football season. This is broadcasting the week of New Year's. We're winding down football, and we'll get into some basketball and other things in the winter and try to have some fun with that. And then we'll see what happens in the spring with baseball and such. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to me, and I appreciate you following us as long as you have. And until next time, I'm your host, Sean Enos, and we'll talk to you in a week.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.